By moving the gallows into the prison, the authorities also wanted to introduce a more official and systematic way of killing, which would be carried out by professional hangmen.
But you had the rise of regular hangmen. One of the things they could do, and this was developed in a very systematic way, was they could take the weights and measurements of the person they were going to kill. They would view them in a prison cell through a loophole, so they could gauge this person's stocky, this person's thin, this person's 5'3" or whatever. And when there was scales and measurements by which you could then judge how much rope you would use and the quality of the rope. That would ensure that you neither made it too long, in which case you might decapitate the person, or too short, in which case you might strangle the person, just the right length, which should lead to instantaneous death.
Hangmen were now expected to carry out their duties in an orderly and responsible fashion.
One of the concerns that the Home Office had was the amount of drinking that the executioners used to engage in. And so that was restricted. From then on, they had to spend the night in the prison before the hanging, and they were only allowed a quarter pint of spirits and a couple of pints of ale the night before. So it was all much more dignified.
This move towards a dignified system of capital punishment silenced those voices who had called for the abolition of the public execution.
And once it's proposed to hide the executions in the prison, the argument is one for sustaining capital punishment all the way through to the 60s. So it's a key moment. Had there not been a solution to the problem of the crowd found in the hiding of executions, the whole thing might have collapsed much earlier than it did.
The Victorian era saw a major shift in how a modern civilized society maintains order and administers punishment.
The great transformation of punishment in the modern era moved its locus from the body to the personality. That is, originally, punishment was the infliction of pain and suffering on the body. And then the Enlightenment came along. And the Enlightenment embraced the idea of human beings as rational. And instead of inflicting pain and suffering on the body, we took the great good not to be so much life as liberty. So that we now correlate the heinousness of the crime with a degree of loss of liberty. And instead of inflicting pain and suffering directly on the body, what we do is we deprive people of rights.
For the next 60 years, it appeared that those who supported capital punishment had won the debate.
Hangman, hangman, hold it a little while. I think I see my friends coming, riding many a mile.
Into the first half of the 20th century, executions continued inside the walls of Britain's prisons without any significant opposition.
What did you bring me, my dear friends? Keep me from the gallows pole.
While public opinion remained solidly in favour, only a handful of eccentrics, like the heiress Violet van der Elst, campaigned against the death penalty.
Mrs. van der Elst is one of those curious figures in capital punishment because she was a classic, eccentric Englishwoman. She inherited a lot of money, and she decided not to take up the cause of cats and dogs, but to take up the cause of capital punishment. And because of her money and her sense of stage management, she could ensure big displays wherever she went. So, for instance, when executions were taking place in prisons, she would drive up to the prison in a Rolls Royce. So she was much more difficult for the authorities to handle, because you couldn't just sort of knock her out the way. A, she's a woman. B, she's rich. C, she's sort of rich and well connected. And she's in a Rolls Royce. In some ways, of course, she was a person that proponents of capital punishment could point to and say, well, it's lunatics who are really concerned about this sort of thing.
Kept from view by the authorities, capital punishment was now largely beneath the public's radar. But this would change in the aftermath of the Second World War. By executing Nazi war criminals, Britain and its wartime allies were exacting a visual show of justice. And over 200 of these executions were carried out by a British hangman, Albert Pierrepoint, whose deployment to Germany propelled him into the spotlight.
Of course, in the early part of the 20th century, the hangman, the executioner, had been an obscure figure. He was an agent of the state. His identity was covered up. What made Albert Pierrepoint a celebrity was not executing people in the 1930s, but it was when he goes off to Nuremberg at the end of the Second World War and he executes all these Nazi war criminals. And the press sort of dig and find out his identity, and he becomes a celebrity because he's oddly a kind of patriotic icon. You know, it's one of our boys who has had the last word in the war by stringing up all these awful Nazis. I mean, that's the sort of way it's presented. And Pierrepoint then becomes the first and only modern executioner celebrity.
Pierrepoint became a familiar face to British audiences through numerous television interviews.
You always get in your kit, a new rope and an old rope. Well, we always choose the old rope if we can, because a new rope, it seems to lash back. See what I mean? Springing on it, you see. And if you get an old one that had been used before, you've got to examine it well before you use it. Yeah. And you see, you leave a sandbag on that, same weight, hanging overnight. You see. And it's all prepared for the morning then.
There's a kind of macabre fascination to him, I think. And the reason that you have that is, I think, because the concept of executing people has become so detached from people's ordinary lives. In a very ordered, settled, consensual society, to be the person who actually carries out the sentence has this kind of weird exoticism to it, and I think that's why he became such a public name.
Did it matter how you've attached the rope?
Oh yes, there's a certain way in doing it. To be instantaneous, yes, there is definitely. It has on the rope, at the end of the rope, a brass ring light. And the rope goes through that, you see, and you put that under the left jaw. You see, and when he falls and stops dead, it finishes under the chin. Should finish under the chin. It throws his head back and breaks the spinal cord.
The British public may have supported the Nuremberg executions, but by the 1950s, there was increasing disquiet at the continued use of the death penalty. In 1953, this unease was evident in the case of Derek Bentley.